So let's talk about what this looks like. We start with this IT governance board, or, if you will, the IT steering committee. Now, who's going to sit on this IT governance board? Well, according to this MIT study, the single most important person to be actively involved, coming to all of the IT governance meetings, if you want to get that full 20% or higher increase in profits because of your IT governance process, the single most important person to be there is the CEO. Now, in some corporations, if the company is large enough, the CEO may have very little to do with internal operations and direction of the company. That may be handled by a president, or in some cases the COO may be functioning as a COO and president, and the CEO's time and attention is almost entirely as a linking pin function to the outside world. If that's the case in your company, then it wouldn't be as critical for the CEO to be involved on the IT steering committee. But whoever the person is in the company who has responsibility for and is actively involved in determining the day-to-day operations, activities, priorities, funding decisions, etc., that person, whoever that most senior person is, that person should be on your IT governance board. Then you probably want to have the COO, you probably want to have your chief marketing person, you probably also want to have whoever your chief salesperson is. Certainly the CFO would be a necessary member of this board. The CIO obviously is going to be a member of that board. And you may have various business unit leaders also as a member of that IT governance board, or that executive's IT steering committee. Now, feeding in to this governance board, which according to the classical model is probably only going to meet together once or twice a year. Although when they do meet together, it will probably be a couple of day long meeting. And I'll explain the activity there in a little bit. But feeding into this are going to be what we call these self-directed work teams. And there will be several of these, but it's important that there aren't too many of them. And we'll talk about what too many would mean in a little bit. Now, each of these self-directed work teams is comprised of both IT people and business unit people. The more senior, the better, as a general rule. So let's say that we have Frank from IT, and we have Sue from Ops, and we have Jed from Sales, and we have Hank from Marketing, and we have Alicia and Maria from wherever. And these people will meet frequently throughout the year, maybe on a monthly basis, sometimes more often than that. And they're doing real work. They're doing some real solid staff work behind the scenes here. So this is a fairly time-consuming function. It's rarely a full-time function, but it is going to require significant amounts of these people's time. Now, on the second self-directed work team, we might also have Frank, and then other people here. And on the third team, we might have Sue, this same Frank here. And on this fourth team, we have Jed. And on the fifth team, we have Alicia. Now, on this team with Frank, we've got Harvey. But Harvey also sits over here. And on this other team with Frank here, in the second self-directed work team, we also have Ollie. And Ollie also sits over here, etc. But the point is, for each of these self-directed work teams, you have representation on that team from all of the other teams. In this way, you keep from duplicating efforts. So if somebody makes a proposal to this self-directed work team, hey, I think we should be considering the following initiative. If that or a similar proposal has also been made to this other self-directed work team over here, since Jed is in common to both of them, Jed will go, wait a minute, we're already working on that one over here. Okay, so that's the purpose of this. That's how we coordinate between the teams. Now, when we talk about well-defined boundaries, what we mean here is these boundaries of responsibility, so that this self-directed work team is, let's say, only going, and you can define these however makes sense for your company, but this self-directed work team is going to only deal with systems related to e-commerce. This self-directed work team is going to only deal with systems related to IT architecture and standards. This one maybe is related to information security. And this self-directed work team maybe is only dealing with back office systems. And this self-directed work team maybe is dealing with all customer-facing systems that aren't e-commerce. Again, however it makes sense to divide those up for your company. The point is, each of the self-directed work teams needs to have a well-defined boundary of responsibility. So clearly defined that if somebody else in the company, and we're going to be talking about if somebody else is here in a minute, if somebody else in the company gets a bright idea of some great new thing that IT should be doing, he or she will know which self-directed work team that should be directed toward, based on a proper understanding of what each self-directed work team is responsible for. Okay, so now what is supposed to happen is when somebody in the company, usually at the customer interface level of the company, is observing some function that's not operating as efficiently as it should, or some service that the customer keeps asking for but we're not providing, or something's happening at that customer interface, and the folks high up in the company are sort of blind to that because they're not involved in the day-to-day delivery of products and services to the customer, and they're not as exposed to that customer feedback as the folks who are operating at the customer interface levels of the company. So those people operating at the customer interface levels of the company identify some need. They go, you know what, we need to, and then whatever it is. We need to provide the following new services on our e-commerce site. Or we need to provide this new interface in our CRM system that speeds up how quickly we can move through a customer service call. Or we need whatever it is. They're coming up with these ideas, and then they're going to feed that to the appropriate self-directed work team. Now, this self-directed work team has got some sort of bureaucracy involved with it, and hopefully it will be standardized across all of them. But basically, when somebody comes to them with an idea, you need to have certain pieces of information, like we need to know a description, a short description of the idea, what the business imperative is for this, what the potential magnitude of the business value is as best that this person could guess. And again, we get that a lot of times the suggester may not have a full grasp of that. Something about, again, if this person has the ability, the magnitude of the implementation, blah, 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 blah. And then this team has got to take a look at that proposal and do their homework and figure out, okay, what would it cost to build this? What would we anticipate is the real business benefit? What would be the timeline for development? Who is the most appropriate owner of this project, etc. And then doing all that homework, you can see that that's a significant amount of homework behind the scenes. Now, each of these self-directed work teams is responsible for prioritizing the ideas that they get. So if during the course of a year, this team gets 20 suggestions from folks throughout the company, it basically needs to figure out what are the top 3 or 5 or whatever your policy is for how many of these people, how many of those suggestions these folks can forward up to this group, but it can't be very many. Typically it's going to be like their top 3 suggestions. So when one of these folks introduces a new idea, sometimes this team just looks at that new idea and go, okay, it might be a good idea, but it's not going to be in our top 3. We don't have to worry about that. So that cuts way down on how much homework they have to do in researching the business benefits and the justification, etc. for this. All right. So at the end of this planning year, when it's time to forward the ideas that have come from the company up to the IT governance board, each of these teams will have prepared and properly researched and selected, let's say, their top 3 ideas. And what typically might happen here is you might have a 20-minute presentation. Maybe it's a 15-minute presentation followed by 5 minutes of questions and discussions. So that's 20 minutes per presentation, and maybe they've got 3 presentations. Their top 3 ideas that have come in during the last year. So if these guys have 3 and these guys have 3, we're looking at 15 different ideas at 20 minutes apiece. You can do 3 an hour max. So that's going to take 5 hours, which is most of a day, just presenting the ideas and giving the different people in the room the opportunity. I mean, if the COO is yeah, I want to own that one, just give me a couple minutes to tell you all why I think this is a great idea and how enthusiastic I am about it. And then in the second day, if you will, of this annual or semi-annual IT governance meeting, all of these 15 ideas are going to be prioritized by this group based on cost, timetables, business justification, etc. And they will make a decision. All right, we're going to build these 2 or these 5 or whatever. They'll sort of prioritize that list of 15 and pick the top several ideas and decide as a group then that this is what is going to be funded. That's why this guy has to make sure that he's in that meeting. Okay, so that's the general idea behind the classical model of IT governance. Now I have to tell you about one more self-directed work team that I've not mentioned up here, and that is the exception processes. Here's what the MIT study discovered. That if you don't have a way for high priority, urgent, short window of opportunity ideas to make it up here outside the normal annual or semi-annual cycle, then eventually you'll have so many end runs happening that it will undermine your entire process. So what this team is all about, this has got I don't know, however many people on this team, again, well represented because they also sit on somebody on each of these other teams. When somebody comes to them with an idea, and says, you know what, it's February right now, and this IT steering committee is not meeting again until December. And we're having an opportunity open up in the marketplace across the summer. And it's just going to run June, July, August, and September, and then the market opportunity is basically going to shut down. If we're not ready in June to address that, then that's an opportunity that we're just going to completely miss out on, and it's a lucrative opportunity. So you can imagine in that situation that whoever wants to be the suggester or the proponent of this needs some way to not wait until next December to have his idea considered, because then it would be too late. Well, if you don't have this self-directed work team in place, then what happens is this person is going to go to whoever his daddy rabbit CXO is and say, hey, could we slide this one in and get it evaluated really quickly? Well, what have you done? You've backdoored this whole IT governance process. And the more that happens, the more it will happen. And pretty soon, people are not going to put up with this whole process. They're just going to run everything, and your IT governance process collapses. All right, so what the exception processes self-directed work team's job is to figure out, is this really an urgent request? Or should it filter into the normal process? If it really is urgent, then they go do all the homework necessary to determine cost, benefit, ownership, etc. And then they will, either by email or by some sort of ad hoc meeting, convene a quick meeting of the IT governance committee and make a decision on whether or not to fund this exception idea. Now, a couple of other principles also came out of that MIT study. As you might guess, this is a fairly complex structure. And there's a lot of people involved. And so what do you do when Jed gets promoted? And Jed was and promoted and sent someplace else, so he can no longer serve here. And Jed was the prime driver on the back office self-directed work team. Well, you might be tempted to collapse that then into these other teams, and you've now changed the structure. Well, this principle says change the structure as seldom as possible. All right? Also, another principle here is transparency in education. In other words, the number one indicator of how successful the IT governance process was in these companies was how many managers throughout the company could tell you how to interface with this structure, what the different self-directed work teams were, what sort of information they had to have when they went to each of these work teams. So that provides a significant education challenge to the CIO and his team to make sure that folks throughout the company are involved in this. Now, there's another interesting challenge that surfaces after a while. Let's say in the first year that you put this in place, you get lots of good suggestions from around the company. But let's say this team got 20 suggestions and only 3 are allowed to get put forward, and only 1 of those ends up getting funded. So you have 19 people who thought they had great ideas that basically, as far as they're concerned, their great idea got ignored. What happens is the next year they're not quite as interested in participating in the process. And as the years tick by, you'll see that participation by the folks throughout the company, which is where the ideas are supposed to be coming from, that wanes. and your IT governance process becomes less and less effective. So in order to keep that from happening, you're going to have to implement some set of incentives that makes it worthwhile for people to make valuable suggestions, even if those suggestions aren't eventually funded and implemented. All right, so this is the picture then of the classical model of IT governance. All right? There are three other ways this can be done. Now, some of you that are watching this are going, man, that's a horrendous structure. There's an awful lot of people involved, a lot of moving parts, bureaucracies to get put in place, education programs. I mean, you look at the amount of work to be done to cause the classical model to be implemented in your company, and it is enormous. And so the question arises, do I have other alternatives? As it turns out, yes, you do. So let me talk about the other three models to IT governance. Dr. Steve Caldwell, who at the moment is a professor in the business college at USC Upstate, in the 1990s was an executive in the Coca-Cola system. He was a CIO there and did remarkable things. He was responsible for some turnarounds of some parts of the Coca-Cola system that were on the brink of bankruptcy. He was responsible for significant increase in corporate profits. He was responsible for, actually he was the 500-pound gorilla on the CXO team as a CIO. Second only in power and influence in the corporation to his CEO. And while in the Coca-Cola system, Steve did IT governance in an interesting way, and that model has been copied and used widely now. But basically what Steve would do, he would convene the leadership team of the company, which functionally served as his IT steering committee. Steve argued that IT begins with the following realization. IT is a behavioral change tool. IT is a very powerful tool for compelling, encouraging, and institutionalizing behavioral changes throughout the company. So the CIO, in Steve's case that's him, led the senior leadership team of the company in the discussion to discover the consensus answer to the following question. Here's the question. What behavioral change would be most strategic for this company? And he said, consider possible behavioral changes of the customers, of the vendors or business partners, and the employees. So basically what Steve was doing is he was leading the company leadership to consider a question that didn't even appear to have an IT component to the question. The question was, what behavioral change would be most strategic to us? Is there some behavioral change that if this happened in our customers, that would be strategic for us? Is there some behavioral change that if this happened in our vendors or our business partners, that would be strategic to us? Is there some behavioral change among our employees? That would be strategic to us. And of course they could come up with ideas in all those categories, and then they considered which of these would be most strategic to us, and that's what Steve wanted. Steve wanted the answer to that question. What behavioral change would be most strategic to this organization? Now, as you consider that for your company, you might be thinking, well, let's see, if we could get the customers to all buy twice as much stuff from us in a given year as they're currently doing, that would be strategic. Or if we could get prospects who are considering us to become their next vendor, If we could get a lot higher percentage of those people to actually make the decision to do that, or in terms of our vendors, if we could get the vendors to make sure that they're always delivering the goods that we need, the raw materials that we need in a just-in-time way, or if we could get our employees to be more whatever. Those would all be significant improvements in building value in the company. So Steve encouraged the leadership team to have those discussions, work through all those different questions, and then come up with a final answer. And he said, okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that over to my IT team, and we're going to figure out how to build an IT system that compels and encourages that kind of change. All right, so that's Steve's approach to IT governance. It's a very business strategic centered approach. It's very top down. In other words, he's not probably giving a lot of opportunity for the customer facing parts of the organization to participate in that discussion. Their bosses, who need to have a good sense for that, but we know that that's going to be somewhat limited, are the ones that are having that discussion and coming up with that solution. So it's providing strategic solutions. It's a fairly quick process, although that's certainly the answer to that discussion, to find the answer to his question, is not going to be a single meeting. There are going to be multiple meetings over probably a several weeks period of time while the leadership team works their way through what would be most strategic to the company in terms of changes. Now, what I find interesting, first of all, experience has shown that the answer to the Caldwell question often provides the best strategic IT initiatives. I was a little skeptical about how well that would work when that was introduced by Caldwell here at the Institute, probably 7 or 8 years ago now. But I have seen that question applied over and over and over, and it normally provides some pretty impressive solutions for the kinds of things that IT should be doing to create significant strategic value in the company. So that, in a nutshell, is the Caldwell model of IT governance. Next, we take a look at the Routh model of IT governance. And the Routh model, first of all, we go back to the 5-step process for IT alignment. Now, if you haven't heard or watched the lecture yet on IT alignment, we encourage you probably to stop this lecture now and go watch that lecture, because the Routh model of IT governance requires you to have a pretty solid grasp of what the 5-step IT alignment process is all about. But basically, what the Routh model of IT governance talks about is we're going to look at each of these 5 steps of IT alignment and try and garner maximum participation of the leadership team of the company in each of those 5 steps. So, for example, in step 1, which is coming up with a written list of strategic business goals for the company, instead of going to the CEO and having the CEO give the leadership team of the company what those goals are, the Routh model of IT governance would suggest that what we do is we have a leadership team meeting to determine what those goals ought to be, and that the CEO moderating that meeting would conduct a set of discussions with the goal of being, when we get all done, we want 2 or 3 or 4 strategic goals that this company is committed to, that the whole leadership team owns along with me, the CEO, and we're going to put metrics on these so that we have specific metrics of success and time frames by which those have to be completed. And we don't want the list to be very long. Again, this goes back to a previous lecture where we talk all about how to do this. But the notion of including the entire leadership team in those discussions so that when you get all done, the entire leadership team owns that strategic goal list, that would be what's happening at step 1 of the Routh model of IT governance. At step 2, the identification of the business initiatives throughout the company that support those strategic goals, the Routh model would now say that the CXOs need to be working as a team to determine what initiatives make sense in order to support the strategic goals of the company. Instead of going off into their separate corners once that strategic goal list is published, and each of them coming up with initiatives that make sense within their silos. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have that discussion as a team discussion, where everybody on the leadership team has an opportunity for give and take and feedback as we work through each of those initiatives, developing it, first of all proposing it, then developing it, and finally settling on the funding for that. Step 3 is to brainstorm. In the IT alignment process, we talked a lot about establishing ITAB groups to come up with creative new opportunities for IT to improve both the strategic goals directly and to improve the business initiatives coming out of the CXO level of the company. The way that the entire leadership team participates in step 3 is for them to ensure that they have very high quality people to contribute to those ITAB groups, and that those people have the time freed and the priorities set to understand that what they're doing in these ITAB groups is very important. At step 4, we have the prioritization of the ideas that are coming out of these step 3 ITAB groups. And at step 4, that prioritization now is going to be done by the leadership team, sitting down as a team and considering all of the different ideas that have come out of step 3 with the IRRs associated with each of those groups, the costs, the time frames for development, etc. The final funding decisions will come out of step 4. And then step 5 of the Routh IT governance model is that the entire leadership team would be the ones that are the accountability piece for, are we getting that business value that we were promised from each of these different IT initiatives. Along the way, of course, we're going to see different CXOs take ownership of those initiatives so that they're no longer really viewed as IT initiatives, but that they're viewed as business initiatives in the company. Not with the CIO being the owner, but with the business unit leaders being the owner. And then to have a post-project audit process, again, that we talked about in the IT alignment lecture, to have a post-project audit process that specifically has specific plans for how we're going to measure the business benefit, what we're expecting those to be, and reporting that back to the entire leadership team now, and then have the entire leadership team work together on management solutions whenever those business benefits are falling short as to what we might do to make sure that we're achieving the maximum benefit of these new business systems with huge IT components. So in a nutshell then, this is what the Routh model of IT governance looks like. Now at this point we want to talk briefly about the ERM, or the Enterprise Risk Management model of IT governance. This is a risk-based approach to IT governance. This approach basically is looking to identify the risks to the company of various different IT systems not being built. Essentially, it's the inverse way to look at this from the IRR model. In other words, okay, what if we don't build this new CRM system? What is the cost to the company? What are the risks that the company will have to face because we're not going to build a new CRM system? Well, we're going to have waning customer satisfaction, and what does that cost the company? And we're going to have slower customer service processing times. We're going to have higher customer service overhead. We're going to have whatever the CRM system is supposed to do. We look at not doing that and assess that in terms of risk to the company if that gap isn't addressed. So we're going to look at all the different potential risks to the company that exist with or without IT systems, and then try and identify IT systems to mitigate those risks. And if we didn't build the IT systems that we're considering, what risks would accrue to the company? And after we've done a risk assessment and prioritized all those risks, it will become apparent which IT systems we need to be building, because those then are the IT systems that provide the greatest risk mitigation to the value creation of the company. We will talk more about the ERM model of IT governance in a separate future lecture. That's enough to give you an idea of it right now. Now what we want to do is we want to spend just a little bit of time here comparing the 4 different models for IT governance. So let's think a minute about characteristics of the classical model. The classical model doesn't require a lot of CXO time. 2 days a year, or 2 days every 6 months, in this IT governance meeting, where they look through all the different proposed systems and make a prioritization decision and a funding decision. Okay, that's not a lot of CXO time compared to the other models of IT governance. You're going to get a lot of participation from the customer-facing parts of the company. So in that sense, it's a sort of a bottom-up approach to IT governance. So this is going to give you a clearer view of where the challenges are that face the company at the customer interface pieces. After all, what's business all about if it's not satisfying customers? You're going to get solutions that are addressing real-world problems. So those are the pros, or the advantages, of the classical model. The disadvantages here is it takes the longest. In other words, it's the most resource intensive of all 4 models, well, with ERM potentially excluded in that. It certainly takes fewer resources, or it takes more resources than the Routh model and the Caldwell model. So you have this massive structure. Change takes a long time. You have to put a lot of band-aids on this as you move along, and it tends to be bottom-up, which means most of the suggestions that are going to be filtering into your IT governance system at these self-directed work team levels will be tactical solutions. Now, what do you call a tactical solution that creates huge value addition to the company? We call that strategic. But a lot of times the suggesters of the ideas are not going to have a strategic view of the company. They're looking at some particular tactical problem, and they're coming up with solutions that address that tactical problem. All right, so the classical model will tend to be skewed toward tactical solutions and may overlook some significant overarching strategic solutions, because only the people at the top of the organization have that view, and they're not the ones making the suggestions as a general rule. All right, so let's take a look now at the advantages and disadvantages of the Caldwell model. All right, so one of the advantages of the Caldwell model is you get the senior leadership team to think, maybe even deeper than they've been thinking, about what kind of changes are in the best interest of the company. Because remember, the Caldwell question is not an IT question. It's a business behavior question. And so as the leadership team is forced to think through what business behavioral changes would be most significant to the company, it will become apparent to many of those corporate leaders that a lot of the behavioral changes that they've been talking about, there's a lot they can do to help implement some of those, even without IT support. So that this is going to see improvement in company operations, even aside from the IT question and IT input. The ideas coming out of this discussion The highest priority ideas are obviously going to be significant strategic proposals, and it requires the least amount of structure. I mean, all you need are several meetings of the leadership team, and that's it. Nothing like the ornate, elaborate structure of the classical model. In terms of disadvantages, sometimes it's very difficult for IT to figure out what the IT systems need to look like to create those behavioral changes that the leadership team has identified. In Caldwell's case, there were some fascinating challenges that he faced in coming up with implementing behavioral changes. For example, in one of the years when he asked this question, the leadership team said, well, if we could get our customers to quit buying Coke based on price and start buying Coke based on brand, that would be huge to us, because we could raise the price on Coke so that it was no longer cost competitive, and all of the price increase goes straight to the bottom line. So that would be strategic for us. So then the question facing Caldwell is, all right, so now what does he do from the CIO seat to cause the buying public to be buying Coke based on brand instead of price? Now, he found a solution to that question. It's a fascinating solution. It's fascinating that it was done from the CIO seat and not the marketing seat. But at any rate, the point is sometimes it can be difficult to figure out how to build IT systems that create the behavioral change that the senior leadership team wants. In Caldwell's case, Caldwell was only interested in tackling the single most strategic question. He didn't really want to know what was in second place or third place or fourth place in terms of prioritization coming out of that senior leadership team. And there's no opportunity for low-hanging fruit with the Caldwell model. Because Caldwell's not interested in, well, here's something that wouldn't be quite as strategic as something else, but we could do it quickly and we could do it cheaply, and this would be a big win for not a lot of cost. Again, Caldwell's not focusing on those kinds of solutions. He's only interested in the biggest splash in the pond in terms of value creation that can be made, and then dedicating IT to figure out how to make that splash happen. The other CXOs might not take the question seriously. Now, in Steve's case, that wasn't hard because, as I said, he was an enormously powerful and influential CXO. But in some companies that we've seen CIOs try and engage the rest of the leadership team in that question, and they've fallen short of getting the kind of participation and engagement that they need to come up with meaningful answers to that question. So those are potential disadvantages of the Caldwell model. In terms of the Routh model, the advantages of the Routh model obviously are it's going to improve your IT alignment process. You're going to have better ownership of the entire IT alignment process by the whole CXO team, as well as better ownership of the whole IT governance process, because they'll be indistinguishable at that point. The solutions are going to mostly be top-down, although there are some things you can do inside the ITAB groups at step 3 in the IT alignment process that will help ensure the identification of very valuable customer-facing solutions. It's going to identify several top IT solutions, not just a single solution like the Caldwell model does. At step 3 of the ITAB group, you actually should be including the Caldwell question. In other words, the Routh model of IT governance advocates a hybrid with the Caldwell model, so that if you're pursuing the Routh model of IT governance, you are also going to be involving the leadership team in finding the answer to the Caldwell question. And it explicitly prescribes post-project audit processes so that there's going to be better accountability, which means you're going to more likely get the potential business benefit that's promised by the initial concept of these solutions. Disadvantages is it tends to be blind to the needs of the bottom of the organization unless you do special things at step 3 in the ITAB groups to ensure that that happens. And it's a long process. If you're going to follow the Routh IT governance model, it's going to be many months working through all 5 steps of that process, and then it has a tail that goes on for years in the 5th step as a post-project audit accountability step. And it requires a lot of time and a lot of attention by the CIO throughout the entire process. So this is a very CIO intensive process. To taking a look at the advantages and disadvantages of the ERM model, it produces a full risk assessment and risk mitigation strategy, and that's becoming increasingly popular in the business world, especially in certain sectors like the finance sector and healthcare sectors. It provides better protection against negative market events, and it helps you identify projects that shouldn't have been done in the first place, or that wouldn't, both that wouldn't have been and that shouldn't have been. So we talk in the ERM lecture a little bit about the fact that 75% of major IT initiatives are not successful. That's a Gartner statistic. So only 25% of those IT initiatives that are funded end up being relatively close to on time, relatively close to budget, relatively close to meeting the requirements that were initially envisioned, relatively close to being used by everybody who should be using it, and relatively close to providing the business benefit that was initially envisioned. So that's how we define a success, and only about 25% of major IT expenditures could be categorized as successes. With the ERM system, that number is going to go way up. Disadvantages is it requires complete management cultural change for reasons that we're not going to go into here, but in the ERM lecture we cover that. Implementing ERM is hard and normally takes multiple years because it does require cultural change. Sometimes things you should be doing get precluded because you couldn't come up with the risk mitigation for all the risks, and sometimes management from negatives instead of positives produces a strategy that's really good at being cautious, but sometimes lacks the aggressiveness to be as competitive as you need to be in the marketplace. So, closing thought here, most people end up with a hybrid model where they pick one or more of the 4 basic models and then hybrid them together. So let me just talk about that for a moment. So I had one CIO one time, he looked at all of those models and he says, I'm going to actually do all 4 of them together. And I said, how are you going to do that? And he says, well, we're going to have a steering committee. I'm only going to have one self-directed work team. This team is going to be required to consider the Caldwell question, this team is going to be required to pursue the Routh model, and we're also going to do a risk analysis. So the Routh model, pursuing the 5-step IT alignment approach, is basically looking at the internal rate of return of each of the proposals and prioritizing based on those. The risk analysis model is going to also look at the risks that they bring to the organization and what the risk mitigation would cost. And after we take a look at all of these together inside here, then we're going to forward those conclusions up to the steering committee for a final decision. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So that would be an example of one client who looked at all 4 of them, saw merits in all 4 of the models, and decided to come up with a sort of a simplified hybrid system where he takes what he thought was the best pieces of each of the models and puts it in to his IT governance model. But once you have these 4 different models of IT governance, it's sort of the alphabet It shows you what your options are. Each of these models is in use in many companies throughout the global business world. So they're all standards, and the question is, does hybriding some of those together make sense for you? And I will leave that as your decision now that you understand what the models are, what their advantages and disadvantages are. Hopefully you'll be able to come to a solution that makes sense for you and your company. Thank you.